One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and in this episode of Follow the Money, we'll be listening back to an interview I did as part of a series of webinars hosted by the Australia Institute's Nordic Policy Centre as part of Nordic Talks. Nordic Talks brings together experts to discuss global challenges with a focus on Nordic policy. Recent Australia Institute research shows that in Australia, women earn about $1 million less than men over their working lives. Despite the gender pay gap narrowing slowly, at the current rate, it will only be eradicated by the year 2053, when more than 60% of the current workforce will be retired. To close that gap faster, Australia could look at policies adopted by Nordic countries, who are frequently ranked as world leaders in gender equality, particularly Iceland. I spoke with Dr. Marian Baird, Professor of Gender and Employment Relations, Co-Director of the Women, Work and Policy Research Group at the University of Sydney Business School and Fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, Asdis Arnalds, Director of Social Science Research Institute at the University of Iceland, and to Emeritus Professor Andrew Scott, Convener of the Australia Institute's Nordic Policy Centre. Thanks, everyone. And I'm really delighted to introduce today's webinar. The topic is Breaking the Ice Ceiling, Gender Equality in Iceland and Australia. And we've chosen this topic because Iceland has really outstanding levels of gender equality, and that's been achieved through a number of different policies, including extensive paid parental leave, which as part of that also includes a real emphasis on fathers using paid parental leave. And this emphasis on paternity leave is just one of the important reasons that Iceland is frequently ranked as a leader among all the Nordic nations, and of course then a world leader in terms of gender equality. So Australia has a long way to go to catch up with Iceland on gender equality, but there are some really promising changes underway at the moment. And to discuss all of this, I'm delighted to introduce our three guests for this evening. Dr. Marian Baird is Professor of Gender and Employment Relations, Co-Director of the Women, Work and Policy Research Group at the University of Sydney Business School, and also a Fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. Asdis Arnalds is the Director of the Social Science Research Institute at the University of Iceland. And finally, Emeritus Professor Andrew Scott is Convener at the Australia Institute's Nordic Policy Centre. Welcome to all of our panel. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Asdis, if I can come to you first, can you tell us a little bit about Iceland's paid parental leave scheme, and in particular, the emphasis that it places on fathers taking part of that parental leave?
Yeah, so the current leave scheme, it allows 12 months of paid parental leave for parents. And out of these 12 months, 6 months are for each parent. So if the parents are a father and mother, this means that there are 6 months for the father and 6 months for the mother. However, each parent can transfer 1.5 months to the other parent. So this means that 4.5 months for each parent are non-transferable. So the encouragement for fathers to take leave, this non-transferable leave, the meaning behind it is to encourage fathers to use leave, because if fathers do not use these non-transferable months, as the word describes it, these cannot be transferred to the mother. So this would mean that the family's leave period would be shortened if the father wouldn't use the leave. So this non-transferable aspect is a huge encouragement.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be. And overall, Asdis, how much is paid parental leave part of Iceland kind of being a world leader when it comes to gender equality?
Yeah, I would say it plays a big part. So it encourages the labor market participation of women. So women do not have to withdraw from the labor market when having children. For a long, I mean, they do for a few months, but it's not like it in many countries where women have to resign from the labor market for several years because of childbirth. Yeah, so it encourages the labor market participation of women, mothers, because fathers are taking an active role in care. So parents are dividing the care of their children, which means that the mother can return to work when the father is using his part of the leave. Yeah, so that plays a huge role. And also in terms of children's access to both parents. So children are growing up, getting to know both the father and the mother. So fathers are taking an active role in caregiving. So that is also a very important aspect, I would say.
Yeah. Marian, if I can come to you next, how does Australia stack up if we make Iceland the kind of gold standard?
Thank you. Thanks, Ebony. And good evening, everyone. I'd first of all like to say that I'm coming to you today from Camaragal country, which is just north of Sydney Harbour, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also note that this land was never ceded, and encourage people to really think about their position on the voice and take part in the referendum. How does Australia stack up? Well, paid parental leave has been a really significant hot policy topic in Australia for over a decade. We didn't get a paid parental leave system until 2010. And that was a major breakthrough. We hadn't had such a scheme before, and that took us out of the nations that had no paid parental leave scheme into the category that have some paid or quite extensive paid parental leave schemes. The only major country without a paid parental leave scheme now is the USA. So how does the scheme stack up? Well, at the moment, we have 20 weeks until July 1, and then it will change. But for the moment, we have 18 weeks for the mother or the primary carer and 2 weeks set aside, or to use the same language, reserved for the father, dad and partner pay. However, that is changing. And from July this year, 2023, that 18 plus 2 weeks is being rolled into the same bundle of 20 weeks altogether, and 2 weeks will be set aside for the mother or primary birth parent, and 2 weeks for the partner, which is a father or single same-sex partner. Now, how does that stack up? Right now, Australia is probably in the last quarter of the ladder. It's a bit difficult to make direct comparisons, but from 2026, we do jump up the ladder because the new Labor government has introduced changes to the scheme, which will see the scheme increasing by 2 weeks every year until 2026, to the point that we have 26 weeks paid parental leave. The exact composition of that 26 weeks is yet to be finalised.
So, yeah, that sounds like some changes are on the way there, as you've mentioned, Marian. Andrew, I know the Nordic Policy Centre has kind of looked into this issue, and you've been particularly highlighting how important it is, the role of fathers in taking paid parental leave. Why is that so important?
Well, Marian's right that we didn't get paid parental leave in Australia till 2010, and then we got paternity leave in 2013, so it's 10 years ago. It's dad and partner pay, but it's only 2 weeks, and it's still only 2 weeks a decade later. The Iceland situation that, as just outlined, the minimum a father can take in Iceland if the family is to get paid parental leave is 18 weeks. That's 9 times what we have in Australia. It's a pretty big difference. And it's similar in other Nordic countries, 3 months minimum for fathers in Sweden. Started at 1 month, went to 2, then to 3 because it was working. and it was seen that it would work better. It's important because if fathers are getting leave, taking leave and involved in the care for their children, that is supporting mothers to be able to return to work in due course after their own leave. It's better for the children. It's better for families. It's better for all the people involved emotionally. And it's something we have to make happen to a greater extent than it currently does in Australia. It's well overdue to increase paternity leave, I think.
Yeah. As just coming back to you, I want to ask, we've kind of talked about the length and who gets paid parental leave, but what are the provisions for how much parents are actually entitled to as part of that leave? Is it at full pay? Is it a partial kind of replacement wage? Is it the minimum wage? How does Iceland calculate it?
So parents receive 80% of their previous monthly salary while they're on leave. So when calculating how the benefit amount, the calculation is based on the average monthly salary 12 to 6 months prior to childbirth. However, there is a ceiling on payments. So there's a maximum amount parents can get. So although the main rule is that they receive 80% of their previous salary, if they have an income above this certain maximum amount, they will not receive 80% of their salary, but a lower percentage because if they have higher wages. What's kind of problematic at the moment is that the ceiling is quite low. It hasn't been heightened in, I think, 4 years. If I'm not mistaken, maybe even 5 years. Yeah. So currently the maximum payment is 600,000 Icelandic kroners, which according to my calculations is 6,328 Australian dollars a month. So so currently, I think 37% of fathers have an income above this ceiling. So this ceiling, it's more likely to affect fathers than mothers because fathers tend to have a higher income than mothers. So because they haven't heightened the ceiling for quite some years, I worry that this may impact fathers' use of leave because it did so 10 years ago when Iceland was hit by the global financial crisis. Then the ceiling or the maximum payment was lowered severely, and this had an impact on fathers' leave use. Yeah, but in general, parents receive 80% of their salary if they are in paid work, but if parents are not working, they receive a fixed benefit. So students and those outside of the labor market, they received a fixed amount, which is quite low. Yeah.
Okay. Marian, how does that kind of 80% of your previous month's wage compare to Australia?
Yeah, this is one of the really big differences between the schemes, between the Australian and the Icelandic scheme, or the Australian and the Nordic country schemes. The Australian pay rate for those parents who are on paid parental leave is the national minimum wage. Now, one aspect of that, which is different to Iceland, is that is reviewed every year. So the minimum wage does move every year in Australia. However, I think one important thing to remember when we compare the countries is the funding mechanism. In Australia, payment for paid parental leave comes out of what we call general revenue, and that has been a little bit of had a dampening effect on the ability to pay more. So the other part of the scheme in Australia that people have to think about when we think about the totality of parental leave provision in Australia is, what do employers provide? And in Australia, when employers provide paid parental leave, it's in addition to the government scheme, and it is typically at wage replacement levels for the father and or the mother, or for both parents. Now, not all members of the workforce get the employer provided leave. About just over 50% perhaps. And so we have to think about the national scheme as really the base level or the minimum rate scheme. And in addition to that, one of the things we'd like to see more of is employer provision. So when we talk about that, there's been a lot of movement in Australia in terms of employers opening their schemes up for both parents and not distinguishing between mother or father, primary or secondary carers. The government scheme, in changing to 20 weeks and increasingly to 26 weeks, looks like it also won't make such sharp distinctions, but there will be reserved periods of leave for each parent. The problem will be the same problem that ASDIS has outlined. When it's continued to be paid at the minimum wage, there is a little bit of for some families and households, a disincentive for the father to take longer periods of leave. But of course, the same applies to women when they take leave. If they're earning above the minimum wage, they also drop back. And one of the big factors that we would like to see changed in Australia is that the superannuation component be added to that period of paid leave as well. And women are really falling behind in terms of not receiving superannuation while they're on paid parental leave. The government scheme, some employers are providing superannuation on that as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Marian. And the Australian Institute has done quite a lot of work around the gender pay gap and periods outside the workforce, but in particular, that super isn't paid on paid parental leave. It just, if you have multiple children and then later on care for parents, all that time out of the workforce just compounds, so that, we can now see that, older women going into retirement, there's just such a huge gap in their retirement incomes, essentially.
Yeah, so that's really the income gap over a life course. Expands.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, coming back to you and the Australian context, often people will kind of talk about the fact that, somehow the Nordic countries are mythical and what works there won't work in Australia. What's your response to those kinds of naysayers?
Well, firstly, I'd point to ASDIS sitting there, and she's a real person in a real place there in Iceland, for a start. And they may seem mythical for those who think the world works according to rational economic choice textbooks, but the world doesn't work that way. They're real places. Combined population of the Nordic countries, the 5 Nordic countries, is slightly higher than Australia's population. They have changed themselves historically. I mean, Iceland, we've just heard how much Iceland has changed itself in recent times. So has Sweden. Thomas Piketty wrote that before the 20th century, Sweden was one of the most poorest and most unequal countries in the world, then became one of the most equal and highly prosperous. So I think, that's and the same people who say that often say that we live in a globalised world and we can't do what we used to do in Australia. We can't afford to do things we used to do. And yet they then say we can't learn from other countries. Well, if you're into globalisation, you have to get beyond the Anglosphere and look at countries like Nordic countries. I just want to, on that note, just briefly highlight, for me, the outstanding finding of the research by ASDIS and her team in Iceland is that for babies born in 1997 in Iceland, only 40% of couples who were parents equally shared the care of their child at age 3. By 2014, when babies were born, that had nearly doubled to nearly 80% of parents sharing equally the care of their children. Now, that is a stunning achievement, which shows what policy change can bring about, and we can achieve that too in Australia. I don't see any reason that couldn't be reality.
Andrew, I completely agree with you. Policy does drive behavioural change. There is no doubt about that, and there's research, especially in the area of parental leaves. We see that around the world in all countries. But I think one of the dilemmas we have in Australia is we need to lengthen the period of leave as well. So while we have a fixed period of leave, even though it's going to 26 weeks, the more you set aside for fathers, the less that it is available for the birth parent. And that becomes one of the really significant tensions in any policy design. So we really need to extend the scheme, and we need to be able to find ways to pay at higher rates. And I think that's something that we really do have to consider in Australia. We're on the right path, but there's much further to go.
Asda, if I can just come back to you on your research there that Andrew cited. I mean, how important is those, the reserved leave for fathers in driving that shared parental responsibility all those years later? Is that really the key element of that?
Yeah, I would say it is, because referring to that research Andrew just told us about, so the greatest change in fathers' increased participation in care, it occurred between the first two surveys that were done. So we have carried out 4 surveys thus far, but there was this huge jump in fathers' care participation at the age of 3 between the survey that was done before the father's quota was enacted and the one that was done after fathers had gained the right to take leave. So the largest change was between these first 2 surveys, but since then, the fathers' care participation has continued to rise. But as I mentioned, the greatest change was between the first 2. So I would say that this points to the importance of the paid parental leave for fathers.
Yeah.
But I'd like to maybe say a few words about what Marian was talking about regarding extending the leave. So I think one of the reasons for why the fathers paid parental leave for fathers was so well received in Iceland was that it was an extension of the leave. So the father's quota was first introduced in the year 2000, and then the leave was lengthened from 6 months to 9 months. So the extension of the leave, so when the father's quota was introduced, they weren't taking anything away from the mothers.
Yeah.
And the same occurred when the leave was lengthened in 2020 and in 2021. Then they extended the leave and at the same time extended the non-transferable part for fathers.
Yeah.
We know that the pandemic had, in Australia at least, a pretty disproportionate impact on women. They were often in some of the jobs in a lot of the industries that were kind of the hardest hit by the pandemic. Often they were more likely to be participating in casual and part-time work and the first to be let go. Andrew and Marian, I just wonder if you have any reflections on things that we learnt during that period of the pandemic when it comes to gender equality going forwards or backwards, I guess. Marian, to you first.
All right. Thanks, Ebony. Look, one thing that we haven't touched on here, and it's what we learnt through the pandemic, is the importance of good early childhood education and care. And that period of time during the pandemic when it was made freely available to most families, that really was a game changer. So in addition, if we want to really break the glass ceiling and if we want to enable both parents and all people to participate in the paid labour market, we have to have policies that are joined up. At the moment, we have paid parental leave in one basket and then a gap, and then we have early childhood education and care, very expensive, with and also partial coverage across Australia. So one thing we learned was, A, we need better childcare support. B, there was a lot of hope that it would shift gender dynamics at home. And certainly for the first period, there was some evidence of that. But we haven't seen that continue in Australia. The biggest shift seems to have been that during that pandemic time, women started reporting slightly lower levels of being pressed and rushed for time all the time, those stress levels. And one of the reasons we speculate for that is that because they weren't juggling the commuting time. Even though they were doing a lot of time at home, they didn't have that extra. They were doing a lot of assistance with schooling. and they were doing their work, they weren't doing that extra work at the beginning and end of the day. Fathers' stress levels, interestingly, went up slightly because they were participating in that combined activity all the time. So the pandemic taught us a lot of things. I don't think the lessons of gender, of sharing the load, have really carried on to the same degree that we might have wished for. And part of that is the role of workplaces and employers. And that goes to Andrew's comments about, too, it would be ideal for fathers to take more leave, but it's not just the parental leave scheme that we need to shift there. It's the culture and structures of work and of workplaces.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree fully with what Marian said. And I think the making of early childhood education and care in Australia free for a period of time following the pandemic showed how easily and quickly it can be done. And of course, that is the big complement, the supporting additional thing in Nordic countries to extensive paid parental leave. In the case of Sweden, you have 16 months paid parental leave, and then a one-year-old or a 1 and a bit year old can enter a public quality early childhood education and care environment. And we're hearing a lot about the earlier children go into those socialising environments, the better it is for their development. And we're seeing in Australia, in Victoria, a push for free 3-year-old kindergarten, earlier access to 50 public news centres, reducing the dominance of profit providers. And of course, when you have a system dominated by profit provision in early childhood education and care, so much money evaporates into the pockets of a few big companies instead of supporting the parents and the children. So I think we're having a good debate about that, and we're going to have the Productivity Commission inquiry, which is going to be a bit different from earlier Productivity Commission inquiries, given that they've appointed Deborah Brennan as co-chair of it, I think. So that will be an excellent analysis, and I'm sure paid parental leave and how it segues or doesn't yet segue enough into early childhood education and care will be part of that debate. I think Asda did point out in her research that Iceland would have a problem with paid parental leave stopping too short before early childhood education and care in Iceland.
Yeah, the Australia Institute, as I recall, during the pandemic, looked at what the Nordic nations do in terms of early childhood education, and we were one of the early think tanks and organisations basically saying, well, not only is it helpful for children, but it's actually an amazing economic measure in terms of, more women participating in the workforce and helping grow the economy. So I'm not sure if Charlie, who's moderating, can find some of that. I think it was from 2020. And of course, then, it just became really obvious, as Andrew said, that, the government can make it free for everyone overnight if it chooses to, and we just choose not to. I can see we've got still close to 200 people on the line with us. We are going to go to questions from the audience very shortly. I will just ask you, it's super helpful for me, if you can upvote questions that you think are really worthwhile answering. It doesn't have to be yours. And just a reminder that you can type your questions into the Q&A box here. The first question is from Carlo, and this one might be for you, Asdis, because I think it's about Iceland's provisions, that 80% of a parent's average wage over the previous 12 months. And the question is, which I think you've already touched on, but how does that affect those on low or marginal incomes? Can you talk to us about the level of the fixed income that they receive on paid parental leave and what that is like?
Yeah, so the fixed income is paid to those working less than 25%. So if you're working 100%, you're working 7.5 hours a week. So those working less than 25%, they receive this fixed amount. It is quite low. It's actually a bit lower than the unemployment benefit. And this fixed amount is also paid to students, but that amount is quite similar to the amount a student would get from the student loan system.
Yeah. Ebony, can I comment on that as
Please.
well? If Astis is finished, sorry, Astis. Yeah, because I think this is a really critical point for Australians to realise. Ours is paid at the national minimum wage, which is just over $800 a week at the moment. And whether or not you work full-time or part-time prior to having the baby, that is the amount you get. So in our evaluation of the scheme, we found that the women who were in the lowest paid jobs probably benefited the most from the scheme, because it really does act as a very strong safety net for lower paid, lower skilled women, and those women who were not receiving any paid parental leave from their employers. And whether or not you work, you could be working 2 days a week and not be receiving $800 a week, but on parental leave you would be. So it's had a really good effect on groups in the labour market who usually are not benefiting from their inputs.
Yeah. So the next question that I've got again is for you to begin with, Asdis. It's from Glenn, who says, do Iceland's citizens have a different attitude to paying tax that might make this kind of a scheme more saleable than in Australia, in brackets, where we seem to want all of the services at none of the cost?
Yeah. I don't know about the attitudes towards paying taxes actually, but I can tell you about how the leave scheme is financed. So every employer has to pay a certain amount for each employer to it's called an insurance levy.
Yeah.
So it's an amount every employer pays for each employee. So this was something that was paid long before the parental leave scheme was introduced, but this amount was to be channeled into the unemployment fund. But then, because unemployment had been very low in Iceland for many years prior to the introduction of the leave scheme in 2000, then they took part of this insurance levy and channeled it into the paid parental leave fund. So it is financed by employers actually, but it's also financed by state contributions, because the state pays for those who do not receive the income-related benefits. So the state finances the fixed amount that is received by students and those that are unemployed. Yeah, so I haven't actually heard any negativity on this, because when the leave was introduced in 2000, employers weren't worse off than before, because they were already paying this amount to this insurance levy.
Andrew, do you have any further reflections on that? I know you've done quite a bit of work around taxation.
Well, employers don't seem to like paying much tax in Australia, or some don't anyway, mining companies and so on, we're seeing. But that's a big problem for Australia, revenue. And what decisions are made about to whom tax cuts should or should not be given are very pressing and will continue to be. I guess the main point we made, our very first report at the Nordic Policy Centre, we did a report on tax in Nordic countries in Australia. And the word for tax in Swedish and Danish is skatt, which also means treasure, which is actually a really positive word. And indeed, the Danish ambassador to Australia at the time told us that it was not uncommon for a spouse to come home and say, "Scat, I'm home, darling," or "taxation, I'm home." And that is not something you automatically think of here. It is word association with tax. I think reconnecting tax with services. We know that the Medicare levy is a popular tax because people associate it with bulk billing. If paid parental leave is increased, as it should be, the economic benefits from that will create much more revenue than the cost of paying the paid parental leave. More than $100 billion will be added to GDP if women can work at the same rate of full-time jobs here as they do in Nordic countries. And that will far more than pay for the cost of the tax needed to be raised. And more revenue will be created for other things too, including early childhood education and care.
Marian, do you have any thoughts on those differences between, or, how that might make things difficult in Australia, the fact that we don't have employer contributions? Because I do feel like it changes the tenor of what we're talking about. And it feels like in the past we've had more discussions around if it's kind of an employment benefit versus kind of a universal entitlement paid parental leave. Do you have any thoughts on either how we pay for it in Australia or how we could pay for it, or those types of attitudes?
Yeah, look, I think this is a very interesting aspect of the difference between, if you like, the normative settings of the Nordic countries compared to the Anglo countries, Australia being one of those. First of all, employers could argue they do pay because they pay through their own schemes. So we have encouraged or set up a system that is really more of a hybrid model, where we have a government scheme that pays, as I said, if you like, a safety net provision, and employers pay on top of that. The only one could argue to, and this could be an argument made for employers, to level the playing field for all of them, that if they contributed to the scheme through a levy of some sort, it may take the competition out of the employer side. But a lot of employers, of course, use paid parental leave schemes as an attraction and retention mechanism, a policy for their companies. Taxation, I mean, I agree with Andrew on this. I mean, what we have in Australia, people don't readily associate or closely associate enough the services we receive to keep a community and a society running are so important for social cohesion and growth and prosperity for everyone. We have to pay for that somehow, and that is through, in the Australian system, our tax system, and then it's transferred through our social security system to various benefits for people. One of the issues we do have in Australia, I think, with paid parental leave in a policy sense, is that the money comes through the Department of Social Services. It is, and Centrelink, although it's paid, and this is another nice little intricacy of the Australian scheme, most people receive the payment via their employer. And that was intentionally set up to encourage people to see a link between employment and paid parental leave. So the money comes from the government to the employer, to the employee in their regular pay packet while they're on paid leave. So it is an intention to keep that employment connection. But from the work I've done, a lot of people still see the paid parental leave scheme as a welfare payment rather than an employment payment. And, you know, we could debate the distinctions there, but I'll stop for the moment. But I think it's a critical part of our normative framework.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a little bit out of left field, but Richard Dennis in a lot of his writing talks about, you know, just the shame associated with welfare in Australia, deliberately so, that we've kind of, you know, referred to people as dole bludgers and things like that, you know, makes people uncomfortable to feel like they're on it when it's, you know.
Yeah, I don't get the sense, and I've been studying parental leave for 20 years and the government scheme for 13 years now. I don't get the sense that recipients feel ashamed that they're receiving this, and people don't feel ashamed. People are incredibly grateful to have a paid parental leave scheme. So it was a major, I mean, I don't think we should underestimate how important that policy shift, or the introduction of paid parental leave initially in 2010 and then the extension in 2013 was, because it really has changed the policy landscape in Australia.
And yeah, I just still can't get over, I mean, I was, you know, I think it's still in the parliament when working up there when it was introduced, and it's kind of shocking to me now that how recent it was, really. I've got a couple of different questions in here around entitlements. One question around in both schemes, what happens for single parents, mostly single mothers, and another one asking about the father's leave provision and how that works for same-sex couples in both countries, which I think we've touched on a little bit. But as just in the first instance, could I come to you on how that works in Iceland?
Yeah. So in Iceland, parents don't have to share residency to be entitled to paid parental leave. So it's an individual right, not a family's right. So a father doesn't have to live with the mother to be able to go on paid parental leave. But if a father doesn't share a residency with a child, the mother has to sign a written agreement that the father is allowed to take the leave. Yeah, so it doesn't matter if you're a single parent or cohabiting or married. This is your individual right. You have the right to take paid parental leave. Regarding same-sex parents, so in the Icelandic law on paid parental leave, there is actually no mentioning of a mother and father. It's always the wording is each parent. So yeah, it's an individual right. It doesn't matter. Your sexual orientation doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you live with a child or not.
Yeah. Marian, your reflections on that?
Yes, I mean, it's in Australia, the one positive change is that the 20 weeks is now available in total to single parents, not just who are mostly mothers, single mothers, not the 18 weeks. So they've got the whole 20 weeks, and that will go to 26 weeks in 2026. It's also available to adoptive parents in the same way that it would be to other households. And in terms of same-sex couples, it's always been the case in Australia that they aren't penalised. It's fine. There's been no question. That's been part of the discussion about the naming of what we're now not calling it anymore, but dad and partner pay was one way of getting at that. It was dad or partner pay probably was the better way of putting it.
Yeah. The next question I've got is from Colleen McKinnon, and she says, given Australian Conservatives often dismiss Nordic solutions outright, why don't we use the Canada-Quebec case study? And wonders if the panelists are aware of Quebec introducing use it or lose it 5-week portion for men, and that paternity leave uptake increased from 10 to 80%, and that women's workforce participation also significantly increased. Do you have any reflections on how these types of provisions have worked in Canada or elsewhere that also kind of reinforce this model? Asdas, I might come to you first.
Yeah, well, I'm a bit familiar with the Quebec model, but not that familiar with it though. But me and Marian, we both take part in a network on leave policies. So we've had some introduction there on this system. So yeah, I think this shows that it can work outside of the Nordic countries, really, to introduce non-transferable leave. Yeah.
And I'd agree with that. I mean, the Australian Conservatives who say you can't learn from Nordic countries will say you can't learn from French-speaking Quebec too. They don't like policy.
That's right.
Believe me. And who are these Australian Conservatives? Is it Peter Dutton or is it the Teal voters? And, I live in Melbourne, and there's only 2 seats held by the Liberal Party in Greater Melbourne. And now, are they the Conservatives? Aston was Conservative until a week or so ago. I'm not sure. And if they don't want to learn from the countries that do best in the world, that's their problem. I mean, in life we should always aspire to do the best we can, particularly in matters like gender equality and well-being of children.
And I just always think, if you're looking to improve things, why wouldn't you go to the people who do it best or who have shown how it can work in practice, which is obviously the big advantage that we have here to see, that countries like Iceland and Canada have done, and it's had an immediate impact.
One thing I'd say there, Ebony, if I could, is that yes, we can always learn from other countries, and Australia's in many policy areas sought knowledge from other countries, and other countries have come to Australia, for better or worse, to adopt our policies. But it's not always easy to transport a policy from one country and put it in another country. And we've learnt that over 2 centuries, that you do have to think about the context and the surrounding policies as well. But, to your to the question, a really good point about Quebec, and I can assure them that we often study Quebec as well. But of course, Quebec is seen as an outlier in Canada. So as just said, we do study what's going on around the world. The other thing I'd like to say is that parental leave is such an interesting area because almost every country changes and tweaks their system. So it's not a static policy. I think it's something we have to remember. It's not like we set it and forget it. It's a policy that we revisit. And coming to the issue of whether we're conservative or not, I don't want to enter into the sort of party politics of that. But in research we have done, we see that for both men and women under the age of 40 are both aspiring to share the care of their children. It's especially prominent amongst young men who have a child. I have to say it's less pervasive amongst young men who don't have children. The shift happens for men once they have a child. For women without children and women with children, they're almost as equally aware of the need for supportive policies. And I say this also in the context of other problems countries have, and it does go back to something Andrew said, which was very interesting about the context in which Sweden introduced their scheme. And if you look at most of the European countries who introduced paid parental leaves much earlier than Australia, they did it originally for economic and population measures, really needed to boost their populations after the Second World War, and then they really needed to boost their labour markets. Anglo countries have paid much more attention to the issue of labour market participation, the economic benefits of having a parental leave scheme, and less to the social gender equality benefits, although that is changing. And I'd say all countries now are looking at the population benefits of having supportive work-family policies, not just parental leave, but if you want to grow your populations, you do need to provide that support. And at the moment, many countries are facing stagnant and dramatically falling birth rates, which is a problem for the economy.
My next question is from Erica Hatfield, and this one again, probably first to you, Asdis. Are the gender norms, for example, in English-speaking countries, we would say homemaker versus breadwinner. So the primary kind of person with the biggest income versus the person, staying at home. Is that different in Iceland compared to Australia? What are those gender norms and attitudes like in your experience?
Yeah, so I think women's labor market participation in Iceland is, I think, probably the highest in the world, or at least among the highest. So we don't actually have any homemakers. That's very, very uncommon. So women work, but then they take a short time off from work when having children, usually not longer than a year. In terms of being a breadwinner, that's also a word we don't use that much, but we are very aware of the gender wage gap. So sometimes we use the word breadwinner when we refer to the gender wage gap, that a father is a breadwinner because he earns more than a mother, but it's not used in terms of whether you're in work or not.
Yeah, God, I'm just trying to think of how nice it would be to not even think of those words when you have this discussion. Andrew, is there anything that you want to reflect on in terms of some of those discussions that we've been having on that role and those gender norms? Because it does seem, looking at whether it's Canada or Iceland or elsewhere, that it is one of the key things that helps break that gender norm, essentially.
Absolutely. And I think one of the interesting parts of the complexity of the story too is that Australia actually invented gender budgeting in the 1980s. Marian Saw, who was going to attend but isn't here, but she'll probably watch the recording, has written about this. Australia invented it, but then stopped it. And then the Nordic countries took it up and kept it going. Australia is now reintroducing gender responsive budgeting at various state levels. And I think it's very significant we have the Federal Minister for Women is also the Federal Minister for Finance, Senator Katie Gallagher. And the emphasis which is being placed by the Albanese government on early childhood education care and paid parental leave are economic participation initiatives. They're about maximising the potential of the workforce, and there is quite a bit happening in terms of the gender pay space. And it's, the task force which has been set up, the inaugural Women's Equality Task Force chaired by Sam Mostyn, which will be looking at, if it is only 26 weeks by 2026, how it will be divided. They'll be making some very important decisions in those areas. But Australia has previously exported some good things to the world, maybe should re-import some of its own inventions where they've worked well. And when we talk about learning from the Nordic countries, we're not talking about transplanting. I'm always trying to use the language learning from, adapting and applying some particular policies, mindful, absolutely, of differences, but then, also not blindly fatalistic and pessimistic about prospects for any change. There's a few naysayers who raise unnecessary obstacles.
Yeah, I think it's really worth reflecting on. As I said, it was a Conservative government, just referring earlier to when we made early childhood education and care free for that brief period during the pandemic. That was a Conservative government that did that. They did it overnight. It was wildly popular. If only they had kept it. But, I do think, obviously, hopefully we're not ever going to have another pandemic like we've had. But, it does go to show you that when the circumstances are right and the government can see that it's necessary, in that case, it was particularly necessary for essential workers, that big changes can be made and show that it can be done, and it actually works really well for everybody. I guess I just wanted to wrap up on, the role that this plays in women's economic participation, and how important that is for gender equality, because I guess in Australia, and I'm not sure to what extent in Iceland, as does, really we still have a system where it seems like women are punished for having children, which can't be good for society. You're out of the workforce, you're reducing income. It has impacts further down the road when you get to retirement, problems with unaffordable early childhood education and care kind of compound those issues. But this is kind of where it all begins, is with proper and decent paid parental leave. So Asdas, if I can ask you, if people could take away something concrete that they can do to support gender equality or to support paid parental leave, what's something that you would like people to think about when they leave the webinar tonight?
So as we've been talking about, encouraging fathers to take paid parental leave is very important for gender equality, but also having affordable early childhood education and care. So in Iceland, only 20 years ago, the case in Iceland was quite similar to what you're describing in Australia. So women were really punished for having children. Now we can see in our surveys that mothers are working, about 12 months after childbirth, they're working a similar amount of hours as they did before childbirth. So there is this reduced motherhood penalty, but still fathers do work more hours than mothers. So we still see that mothers are leaving work early to pick the child up from the daycare centers. So, we haven't reached gender equality in Iceland. I think that's an important, it's important to remind us that although we are, very quite, on top, and when we compare us with other countries, then we haven't reached the point of gender equality. But affordable daycare is very important as well, and it should be available when paid parental leave ends.
Marian, to you, what practical things can people take away from the webinar tonight?
I think there's a couple in the Australian context, and that is to remember that there is a separate reserved portion of the parental leave scheme for fathers. And at the moment, only just over a quarter of fathers, we estimate, who are eligible use that. So I would encourage fathers to use that, understanding there may be problems because it depletes their income, to then speak and agitate amongst employers to top that up, to create a situation where we're talking about the need for fathers to take the leave that is available, and for both parents to be able to maintain their income levels to enable equality. And the second part is to remember to talk about superannuation to complete the package. We need that. The third part is over time to continue to increase the full amount, or to increase the total amount of paid parental leave that is available, so that ideally we would get to, the ideal would be 2 years. At the moment, we have 2 years available. Well, it would be longer, but within reach. At the moment, we have 2 years unpaid parental leave available per household. It would be good to see that matched with payment.
And Andrew?
I think we want to work with the grain. We need to work with the positive grain of 26 weeks, the increase to 26 weeks, but we shouldn't assume that is all we can achieve. I agree with Marian about the need for longer leave. One Nordic country we haven't mentioned much is Denmark. It actually has an 18-week minimum for mothers and a 2-week minimum for fathers too. But it sounds a bit like Australia, but it has another 32 weeks total paid parental leave to be shared. That's the kind of so if we had a year's leave like they do in Denmark, paid parental leave, where mothers could take less than the 6 months that the World Health Organization says is optimal, or where fathers could take as much as 6 months, which is pretty much the Iceland arrangement, depending on whether it's transferred. I would like us to leave thinking how we can take this positive development and double it.
Double it. I like the ambition of that. And my final reflection as host is just what a pleasure it's been watching my brother be a father, and some of my friends, my male friends who've been primary caregivers for their young babies, and how much it's enriched their lives, and just what a wonderful positive thing it is for men and not just women to have good paid parental leave and access to it. Thank you so much, everyone, tonight for your amazing questions. That is all we've got time for, I'm afraid. I want to thank all our panelists, Andrew, Asdis and Marian. Asdis all the way from Iceland. Thank you for getting up a bit early to join us today, and appreciate all your insights and expertise this evening. This episode was recorded live on Wednesday, the 12th of April, 2023, and things may have changed since recording. If you like today's episode, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And if you love the show and want to help us continue to do work with impact and influence, please consider supporting us with a small tax-deductible gift today at australiainstitute.org.au. That's also where you can find all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a double N double T. Marian is at Prof Marian Baird. That's MarianBaird. And Andrew is at A Scott N Lights. So that's ASCOTTNLIGHTS. Our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, and with special thanks to Nordic Talks. Thanks for listening.